What is going on, guys? Jeff back here with part number 17 of the Siege Style Project Xylus wide body build. We are moving right along and we are almost done, guys. I am so hyped I can't even begin to tell you. I'd say within about 2 weeks we're going to be wrapping up the wide body project, and man, my hype levels have reached levels that I have not yet experienced in this project. So I'm super excited for those of you guys who have been following this build. It's going to be a huge payoff. I promise you, the first time that we have all 4 over fenders on the car and it is out of the garage and aired out, it's going to look so sick. I promise you guys the payoff will be worth it. So thank you guys for your patience with this project. It has taken me many months. I believe I started this way back in March and we'll be finishing up by the end of the month here. So it's taken a long time, but it will pay off, so thank you guys. And for those of you who are new to the channel, thanks for checking it out. I really appreciate it. Feel free to watch some of the previous videos to get kind of caught up on the build. I've had ups and downs with it and everything in between, so might be an interesting watch for you if you're into fabrication, body work and stuff like that, or if you just like cars, check it out, feel free. With that being said, let's go ahead and move on to part number 17. Now in the last part I did all the sculpting that I was going to need to do. We are officially done with the clay in this build. I do not need to use it anymore. We're going to move on to our composite phase, which is our fiberglass, our gel coat, body filler, and just a whole bunch of sanding and all that. The refinement stage is easily the longest stage of the entire build of one of these things. This is also the point where you're going to notice a significant difference in the build method in the front here than the method we used in the back. Whereas in the back we used the gel coat mold method, where we sculpted up our over fender onto the car and then laid up tooling gel coat over the top to create a mold, which we then laid fiberglass into and pulled a positive out of the negative mold. We're just going to do a one-shot on this guy this time. We're just going to lay the fiberglass right over the top of the entire piece, the sculpted area and the exposed fender area right here. And then once that's all cured up, we're going to do a layer of gel coat, a unwaxed white gel coat over the top, which is very sandable. We can sand it all down and then do our body filling and get all the body lines and everything perfect just the way we want. And then we're going to pull the whole thing off the car all in one piece. There's no mold involved. It's far less time consuming. There's not as many risks with like the mold breaking or something happening to your sculpt and having to resculpt it and all that. It's far less time consuming and much easier to do. There are definitely benefits to doing the mold method, but we don't need those benefits right now. This is going to be the perfect way and the far less time consuming way to do this. So this is where you're going to see a difference in build method. With that being said, let's move on to the actual process. We're now going to go in with PVA over the top. I explained briefly what PVA was a couple of videos ago, so I'm not going to go over that right now, but if you want to know, check it out. It takes about 20 minutes for it to dry, and then we're going to put 2 layers of 6-ounce fiberglass over the top. That will take about 4 hours to fully cure, so I will come back out here tomorrow after it's all cured up, and we'll lay over a gel coat layer, sand all that down, do some body filling, some sanding, some refining and stuff like that to tighten up the lines, get the shape just perfect. And once that's all set, we can then remove the flare off the car, do any work underneath that we're going to need to do. I can tell right away we're going to need to reinforce the bottom, this section right here, pretty good, because there's this little hump right here in the middle that is created by the universal flare that we used. It doesn't sit perfectly flush to the fender, so we're going to need to account for that when we go in and do our refinement and sand that down really nice. But before we can sand that, we got to add the extra fiberglass to the underneath. You will see what I'm talking about once we get it off the car. But let's get started. I don't want to waste any more of your guys' time. I know these videos tend to drag on a little bit, but let's get going and add the PVA. We'll come back out in 20 minutes. Alright, so here we are a bit later, and our PVA is now dry to the touch. I can run my finger across here without any of it coming up off onto my fingers, and so that's a good indicator that we are ready to go ahead and lay up our fiberglass. Now while this was drying, I took the liberty of going ahead and cutting out a couple of large pieces of fiberglass to lay over the entire fender and do everything in mostly one shot as much as we can. I may need to cut it up into some multiple pieces to get into some of the smaller detail areas, especially down in through the front. But pretty much everything else we should be able to get done in one shot. So let's go ahead and get started laying up this fiberglass, and I will show you how I fiberglass the detailed areas as well. Alright guys, well, we have the 2 layers of fiberglass applied now. It's definitely not the prettiest thing in the world, but it will get the job done. I gotta say, this is the most garbage fiberglass I've ever used in my life. Lesson learned, never buy your fiberglass on eBay. I was running tight on time, and so I just figured I'd jump on eBay and get Russ shipping on some glass, and didn't really pay off because this fiberglass is the worst I've ever used. It just does not want to lay up correctly at all. It wants to pop up in so many different places, and it was just so annoying. I was very, very frustrated with it, but I think that it's going to work. I just made sure to lay up the resin real thick so that we got a nice amount of coverage, and so I think it's going to get the job done. We'll go ahead and let this cure. There's going to be a lot of refinement to do, of course, because there's just a lot of air pockets and stuff like that. Even after using my roller and everything everywhere, I just could not get it to lay up correctly around the corners. So that's gonna amount to just more refinement in the end. But we will get it done for sure, and this should work for the time being. So we'll let this cure, and then we'll sand it down real good, get rid of some of the air pockets, and lay up our white unwaxed gel coat layer. And yeah, we'll go from there, see how it turns out. Cross your fingers. Alright guys, so I just got back in from work. This thing has had about 8 hours of time to cure. It's nice and rock hard, as you can hear. Fortunately, it looks a lot better now than it did when I was first laying it up. I had a hell of a time, like I said, laying this fiberglass up. It's just not very high quality fiberglass at all, but it will get the job done, I can tell. It was just very, very difficult to get this stuff to lay down, especially in the very detailed areas like the front portion and some of the detail areas in the back. It just did not want to lay down correctly, so we will have to deal with that as we get into refinement. We're going to have to sand out some of the air pockets and lay up the gel coat in there and just redefine a lot of the lines. It's definitely something that we can do. We're going to be able to work around it, but I wish I wouldn't have had to deal with that, but you know, it is what it is. That's kind of how these projects are, man. You just got to roll with the punches, man. You got to deal with what you get. Fortunately, we're able to proceed, and we can go ahead and move into sanding this down a bit. We got to get rid of the wax layer on the top. This is polyester resin, so the wax inside the resin has risen to the top, and that's what gives it that shiny type of finish. We got to sand that down really good before we apply our gel coat so that the gel coat can grab onto the fiberglass real well. I'm going to be using a fairly low grit sandpaper so we can set in some nice grooves and get through the wax layer on the top. I don't need to get real fine with the sandpaper at all. It's okay to use a rough sandpaper, but don't sand down so much that you start getting through the fiberglass. We definitely don't want to put any holes in the fiberglass right now, but we'll go in with a low grit sandpaper to really put some nice tracks in there for the gel coat to grab onto. So let's get started. I got my dust mask here. I'm just going to go ahead and give the whole thing a nice good sand down, especially in the little corners and the crevices and the cracks and everything. Those areas are very particular, very important. So let's go ahead and get started on that right now. Alright, so we've got the sanding now finished, at least the first stage of sanding. There's a lot of sanding yet to come, but we got the first stage of sanding done. We're pretty much just looking for a nice dull finish on this first go around here, just to make sure we get most of all the obvious waxy areas, glossy areas sanded down, and it doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but just enough so that the whole thing has a nice dull finish to it, and that should be plenty fine enough to go ahead and apply our wax gel coat. Now I've gone ahead and dusted the thing off. We don't want any dust residue, any of the dust remaining, especially in the corners and the detail areas or anything like that. You want to make sure you take a nice brush. I use something like this. It's an old paint brush, and I just go over the whole thing and brush it all off. Make sure that none of the dust is remaining on the piece. Run your hand over the top of it and make sure that there's no dust coming off on your hands, and that'll give you a good indicator that you are ready to go. So we're now ready to go ahead and apply our gel coat layer, and the gel coat essentially serves two purposes. Number one, it's going to serve as a filler. It's going to fill in all the little pits and gaps and everything that are still present in the fiberglass, and it's also going to add a little bit of extra thickness to any areas that require a little more thickness. It's going to even out the entire piece from front to back, so we have a nice base to go ahead and sand down into the final shape that we like. It almost is like a regular body filler, except for it's a little bit stronger. It's an actual resin and a plastic itself. So as opposed to being kind of an accessory to the piece, which body filler kind of is, it's more of a complementary addition to the fiberglass itself. It mends very well, especially if you sand it down really well like we have here. It's going to grab onto that and become all one piece. It also sands beautifully. It's a little bit more difficult to sand than a regular body filler, but it still sands beautifully, and it just gives it a little bit more of a smoother, harder, professional look to it. And the other purpose that it serves is that it's a major reinforcement. Being resin and being plastic and getting as hard and rigid as it does, applying the gel coat increases the strength of your piece tenfold. It's an amazing addition. It's not absolutely necessary to add the gel coat. You can do this with just fiberglass and polyester resin, but I like to go ahead and add the gel coat because I believe personally it just gives it a little bit more of a professional presence, professional finish rather. And not to say you can't achieve amazing results with just the fiberglass, but adding that gel coat, in my experience, it makes the piece stronger, and it just gives off a better finished result. So we are going to go ahead and apply our gel coat to the piece. Now I'm using unwaxed gel coat, meaning that it doesn't have any wax in it at all, so there's not going to be any wax to rise to the top of the piece like in the polyester resin. We had to sand all that wax that rose to the top in the curing process off the polyester resin, but because we're using unwaxed gel coat, we do not have to worry about that whatsoever. If we do need to go in and do multiple layers of the gel coat, we can just lay it right over itself. We don't have to sand it down, sand off any wax layer or anything like that. It will grab onto itself very nicely. Gel coats also come in waxed versions, and those versions you do need to sand off the wax layer that rises to the top if you want to add more gel coat later. So the unwaxed variety works really great for doing multiple layers, which oftentimes I have had to do. So I just go with the unwaxed. It sands beautifully, like I said. I haven't had any issues whatsoever, and that's what we're going to use today. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to mix a little batch up. It uses the same exact MECP hardener as any other resin, so I'm not going to show the process of mixing that stuff because it's fairly self-explanatory, and if you buy some for yourself it will have all the mixing instructions right on the container itself, so I will spare you guys that in this video. I'm going to apply it with a brush. You can apply it gel coat in a variety of different ways. You can spray it on if you have the means of spraying it on. You can brush it on like I'm going to do, or whatever, however you need to do to get it on there. It's fairly simplistic. You just put it on kind of like you do with any other resin, and it takes about the same amount of time to cure. So the only difference between the polyester resin and the gel coat is I'm going to add a little bit of a thickener to my gel coat to get it a little bit more of a thicker consistency. That way it doesn't run quite so easily off the piece. I want it to adhere to a vertical surface a little easier, and in order to do that I add what's called a silica powder to it, which is essentially a very, very fine dust that you can mix to a resin to thicken it up. And I don't want to get it real thick, but I want to get it thick enough so that it's not just going to be dripping off like water. So you'll see as I apply the gel coat to the piece how it will stick to it and not run like a polyester resin without any thickener would. I'm going to be applying it most heavily in the areas that we did not sculpt in. That is pretty much this upper portion right here will be gel coated, and this area right down here needs to be filled really well. We're going to end up sanding this hump down, so I'm not going to be focusing real heavily on the center area right here because that's going to be sanded down anyways. But in this area here where there's a little bit of a dip here, any areas that just need to be tightened up detail wise or filled in, we're going to be going in with the gel coat. But the whole piece won't be the same amount of gel coat all over the piece. It's not going to be necessary to add a lot of gel coat to the front area because we don't want to increase the thickness of the detail areas too much, or we're just adding more work for ourselves. We're just going to have to sand all that back down anyways. So it's mostly going to be on the upper portion of the piece, and I will of course go ahead and just do a light layering probably everywhere else over the thing, but it won't be completely thick all over. It's just going to be enough to get the piece nice and even from the front to the back. We want a nice even surface so that when we go in and sand the whole thing down, it will sand all evenly and we can get a really beautiful finish. Alright, so let's get started. All right, so we have our gel coat applied. You can see it's just a nice even coat across the entire piece, and it's all starting to look a lot like one whole piece now. We got it applied real thick in the areas where we needed to add thickness, and a little finer in the detail areas right here. So we're looking really good, looking very good. I reinforced the sidewall because we're going to end up sanding that down a lot to get it real straight. So I added a little bit extra to the sidewall right there. But in all the detail areas, in the corners, like in here and everything, I wanted to make sure it was fairly fine. You don't want to get it so thick that you lose your detail lines in there. So I just applied it real thin right there so I could make sure I saw my detail lines and I didn't lose those. All right, so we're going to go ahead and let this cure at this point. Like I said, it takes about the same as any other resin, about 4 hours or so. And then we can come out here and take a look, do a little bit of sanding, and see if we need to add any more gel coat. I'm not thinking we will need to, but you never know. Once we get out here and do our first sand down, we'll see if there's any kind of shallow areas or any areas that would benefit from adding a little bit more thickness in the gel coat. But yeah, like I said, I think we're good. Even if we miss a little bit and there is a little bit of a shallow area, we're just going to go ahead and remedy that with regular body filler in the final refinement phase. So we are in good shape, guys. I'm going to go ahead and let this cure. I'm going to go in and get some dinner, and I'll come out here tomorrow. It's getting pretty late, so I'll come out here tomorrow and we'll take a look to see if we need to do anything else. So far, so good, guys.